Welcome to the channel. Today is the 1st of January, 2025, the start of a new year, filled with promises and, as always, a perfect opportunity to reflect on what the future holds. As a journalist who always finds himself on the other side of the fence, in opposition, I bring you a rather critical look at the current state of British politics. We're not here for empty speeches, but to ask the real questions. So stick with me. Today's video is going to be quite the eye-opener. The scene was set early on New Year's Day, and it wasn't long before I found myself in the midst of a discussion, one that echoed through the corridors of British politics. The coffee had barely settled, and I could already sense the tension. A meeting was taking place, one I was hardly invited to, but one I couldn't resist observing. The government was celebrating its achievements, touting every minor victory as a major triumph, while the opposition stood firm, raising its eyebrows in disbelief. Well, I say, this government's idea of progress is nothing more than a glorified spin campaign, Tom, an old colleague from the Labour Party, said with a sneer, his voice laced with that distinct dry sarcasm so often heard in British political circles. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, waiting for a response. "You're not wrong there, mate," I replied, knowing full well that Tom's words carried more weight than any political speech from Downing Street. The government had been putting forward policies that, on the surface, seemed like solutions, but underneath, not so much. It's like a magician's trick. Watch the shiny object in the distance while the real issue is happening right under our noses. Tom chuckled. I'm not sure who's more adept at misdirection, the government or the media. I couldn't help but agree. There was a constant dance between the media and the politicians. The government would announce a new initiative, and the press would eat it up, only for the consequences to be buried under layers of rhetoric. The real questions, the ones that mattered, were never fully addressed. Do you reckon anyone's actually holding them accountable? I asked, my voice low but pointed. Not likely, Tom sighed. Most of them are too busy jockeying for position, licking boots, or chasing headlines. That's the sad reality of it, isn't it? No one's actually tackling the deep-rooted problems anymore. They just band-aid the situation and move on to the next. We both fell silent for a moment, lost in our thoughts, before I broke the stillness. I think it's safe to say that the opposition, regardless of their best efforts, has been largely ignored by the government. They're just playing a game of smoke and mirrors. Spot on, Tom replied, looking me straight in the eye. And the people? They're left confused, wondering which way to turn. Exactly, I nodded. But the thing is, people are starting to catch on, aren't they? Slowly but surely, the illusion is cracking. The more they see, the more they realize that things aren't as rosy as the politicians make them seem. Right you are, Tom said, leaning forward now, his hands on the table. The trust is gone. It's been eroded over time, bit by bit, like a slow drip of water wearing away at a rock. We've got politicians parroting the same tired lines, the same empty promises, year after year, but people aren't buying it anymore. It wasn't just the politicians, though. The media had played its part, too. They'd fed the public what they wanted to hear, rarely digging deeper into the consequences of the government's actions. The public was kept entertained, distracted by the latest scandal or viral moment, while the real issues, the ones that affected people's daily lives, went largely ignored. But, as I said earlier, that was changing. There were cracks forming in the facade, and the truth was beginning to seep through. And how about the economy? I asked, changing the subject slightly. What's the deal with that? Tom's expression darkened. Don't get me started on that. They're all up in arms about their economic recovery plan, but all I see are empty words. We've had years of austerity, and they've cut public services to the bone. And now, all of a sudden, they're trying to convince us that everything is fine. Isn't that the classic move? I laughed bitterly. Shove the issues under the rug, tell everyone it's all going great, and when people start asking questions, suddenly everything's on the mend. What a load of nonsense. He grinned wryly. You sound like you've been listening to them too much. I've had to, I admitted. It's my job, after all. But you can't help but get frustrated when you hear the same regurgitated lines over and over again. That's the thing, Tom agreed. You don't get real change with the same tired rhetoric. And as long as the government is allowed to get away with it, nothing's going to change. But people are waking up to it, I said, my tone firm. They're starting to see through the charade. They are, Tom nodded. But the real challenge now is getting the message out there, isn't it? Getting people to see what's really going on, behind all the headlines and the spin. That was the crux of the matter. The message needed to be louder, clearer. The opposition had to find a way to break through the noise. And perhaps, more importantly, it had to find a way to make the people believe in a real alternative. Not just a vague promise of better days ahead, but a tangible vision of what the future could look like if things were done differently. Do you think it's possible? I asked, genuinely curious. Anything's possible, Tom replied with a glint in his eye. But it's going to take more than just words. It's going to take action. Real action. And that's something we haven't seen in a long time. I nodded, knowing he was right. The people were ready for something new, but the question was whether anyone in power was willing to deliver it. As I left that meeting, I couldn't help but feel that the winds of change were blowing. The question now was whether the opposition could harness that energy and turn it into something that could actually shake the foundations of British politics. Only time would tell. And so, as we embark on this new year, one thing is certain, we are on the brink of something big. Whether it's for better or worse remains to be seen, but rest assured, this is only the beginning. Stick with me, and we'll navigate this political maze together, uncovering the truth, one step at a time. Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, had barely finished delivering his New Year speech when it became clear that his promises were nothing more than a carefully wrapped package of empty words. The speech, which focused on a vision for the future of the UK, seemed to promise the kind of changes people longed for. Yet, behind the well-rehearsed lines and polished delivery, there was an undeniable sense that something was amiss. The speech itself touched on key issues: homes, education, energy, and security. Starmer spoke of the desperate need for affordable housing, lamenting how many young people would never be able to afford their own home in today's market. He promised that under his leadership, this would change. He painted a picture of an ideal world where homes were affordable, plentiful, and well-maintained. The crowd cheered, the audience seemed to nod in agreement, but there was a palpable silence that followed. How would he actually make this happen? There was no plan. No real specifics. Just a blanket statement, suggesting that help would come from regulators who would find ways to boost economic growth. The opposition bench looked on, listening intently, waiting for the moment when Starmer would reveal a solid roadmap. But the moment never came. A few of his closest advisers exchanged glances, clearly concerned about the vagueness of the promises. They knew that in the world of politics, words could be a double-edged sword. Too many general statements and no clear direction meant that the speech could be quickly dissected, leaving Starmer exposed. This was exactly what was happening as the opposition member sat across from their political rivals, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. In the back of the room, a few whispering voices could be heard. "I don't know, mate," one advisor murmured to another, "it's all well and good to talk about helping people get homes, but where's the beef?" The other advisor nodded, their face creased in concern. "Yeah, it sounds a bit like he's handing out sweets, but with no candy inside." Meanwhile, on the opposition benches, a group of veteran MPs exchanged knowing glances. They had seen this kind of rhetoric before, polished speeches that promised the world but never delivered. One of them, an older MP known for his sharp wit, leaned over to his colleague, a younger MP from the north, and muttered, "He's having a laugh, isn't he? All that talk about affordable housing and not a word about how he plans to get it done." The younger MP raised an eyebrow. "It's just fluff. He's playing the long game, hoping the public forgets by the time he's in power." Back in the center of the room, Starmer pressed on, eager to show that he had the answers to the country's educational crisis. "We need to overhaul our education system," he declared passionately. "It's broken, and I will fix it. Every child, no matter where they come from, deserves a fair chance at success." His words were strong, but again, his statements lacked substance. There were no real proposals for how he would improve the education system, just a vague promise to make it better for everyone. Another advisor, clearly frustrated, shook their head. His promising the moon without even a telescope to see it. Outside, as Starmer's speech was broadcast across the nation, the reaction was less than enthusiastic. On social media, the hashtags flooded in. Empty promises, some tweeted. Where's the plan? Others questioned. And then, there were those who just couldn't resist a bit of British sarcasm. Keir Starmer promises to fix everything, but forgot the how. The criticism was swift, and it wasn't just coming from political pundits, it was coming from ordinary citizens who had heard the same hollow promises before. Back in the House of Commons, the debate raged on. The government benches were quiet, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of amusement in their eyes. They knew that Starmer had failed to deliver. One government MP, unable to contain himself any longer, stood up and addressed the chamber. If you want to talk about education, we have a track record. Under this government, we've increased funding for schools, improved teacher pay, and invested in vocational training. Meanwhile, the leader of the opposition is still dreaming up vague ideas while the country needs action, not more talk. The Speaker of the House called for order, but the words stung. Starmer's proposal lacked any real vision. He had failed to outline any concrete steps for the country's future. This was not the first time this had happened, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Starmer, ever the politician, pressed on. He moved on to energy, claiming that Britain needed to take bold steps to ensure energy security and reduce carbon emissions. We will invest in renewable energy and create jobs, he said, his voice rising in pitch with each word. The words seemed comforting, almost reassuring, but there was no clear path forward. The nation had already heard similar promises, only to find that progress was slow or non-existent. In the back of the room, the opposition MPs weren't buying it. He's just stringing them along, one muttered, their tone dripping with disbelief. No substance, just the same old spin. Others nodded in agreement. Yeah, he's good at making it sound like he's got everything figured out, but the reality is far from that. What's his plan to tackle energy prices? No one had an answer, and that was the crux of the matter. Starmer, for all his eloquent speechmaking, had failed to deliver a tangible plan. For those struggling with rising energy bills, the speech felt like a slap in the face, more empty promises from a man who had no real solutions. Starmer's final point was on security. He spoke of the need to keep the country safe and how his government would ensure the safety of every citizen. But again, the promise was vague. No mention of how he would fund the police force, how he would tackle rising crime rates, or what measures he would take to protect the vulnerable. Once again, it was just words without substance. One MP, sitting quietly near the back, sighed deeply. It's all just rhetoric, they said softly, looking around at their colleagues. And the public knows it. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The government side exchanged knowing looks, while the opposition bench held their heads high, keenly aware that Starmer's speech had failed to live up to expectations. As the speech wrapped up, Starmer left the podium, the applause in the chamber polite but tepid. It was clear that his promises had not struck a chord with those in the room, nor with the broader public. He had painted a picture of a better future, but without the tools to make it a reality, it all seemed like a fleeting fantasy. And so, the opposition, ever watchful and ever critical, continued to assess Starmer's every move. For them, it was clear, Starmer's New Year speech had failed to inspire, to offer any concrete solutions, and to offer anything more than a wish list for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. They would continue to stand on the other side, ready to call out empty promises and demand real action, knowing full well that the people of the UK deserved more than vague speeches and unfulfilled promises. The internet, as expected, quickly picked up on Keir Starmer's recent statements, with reactions coming thick and fast. It didn't take long for users to start pointing out the contradictions in his words. While Starmer claimed that there would be more money in the pockets of the British public thanks to his policies, people were growing increasingly confused as taxes continued to rise. A simple question began to gain traction: how could we be promised more money in our pockets when taxes were clearly going in the opposite direction? Social media exploded with skepticism. Comments and memes flooded Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit within minutes. Skeptics were quick to point out the disparity between Starmer's words and their real-world experience. If, as Mr. Starmer says, "We're all seeing more money in our pockets. Why are we still getting the bank statements with our balances creeping up month by month?" one Twitter user quipped. "More money in the pocket, but taxes keep going up. What are we actually talking about here?" questioned another. The reactions were varied, but all focused on one key point: the disconnect between what the Labour leader was promising and what the public was experiencing in their day-to-day lives. Meanwhile, one of the most frequent questions raised in the discussions concerned the lack of tangible progress on house building. Starmer had made this one of his core campaign issues, repeatedly promising that thousands of new homes would be built in the short term. However, so far, few had seen the results. "Mr. Starmer, can you tell us how many houses have actually been built under your watch? Or are we still waiting?" asked one Facebook commenter, sharing a picture of a construction site far from completion. The growing sense among the British public was that they were stuck in a cycle of broken promises, with nothing to show for it. Naturally, the media weren't far behind. With their sharp noses for contradictions, they quickly began unraveling the gaps in Starmer's narrative. Among the most prominent was BBC journalist James Morgan, who, from his position in the opposition, never hesitated to ask the tough questions, always with that trademark British irony. James, with his characteristic sharp style, seized the opportunity to press a Labour spokesperson during a press conference. "If, as Mr. Starmer claims, we're all seeing more money in our pockets, why then are the bank letters still coming through our doors with our balances rising month after month?" he began, raising an eyebrow as he fixed his gaze on the spokesperson. "Is this some sort of magic trick? Or perhaps there's a hidden pocket of wealth we've all been missing?" The room, filled with journalists, burst into nervous laughter, but everyone knew James had a point. The numbers didn't add up, and Labour's leader seemed overly confident that promises alone would silence the criticism. The Labour spokesperson, visibly uncomfortable, attempted to respond with the usual political tone. "What we are proposing is a more prosperous future for all Britons," they said firmly. "We're working to reduce the tax burden while simultaneously improving housing opportunities for families." James wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. "A more prosperous future? I don't see it anywhere. The only future I see is one of broken promises," he shot back with a sarcastic smile. "You talk about cutting taxes, but who's picking up the bill? The taxpayers. And as for the houses, where are they? What we've got are empty promises." The tension in the room was palpable. James Morgan wasn't one to settle for empty answers. To him, the job of a journalist was not just to expose the facts but to challenge the claims of those trying to manipulate the narrative. And in this case, Starmer's promises were too tempting to ignore. Soon after the press conference, the criticism continued to pour in on forums and social media. "It's like they're taking the mickey out of us," one tweet read. "They promise more money in our pockets, but we're tightening our belts while taxes keep going up. And as for the houses, where are they? What we've got are empty promises." Frustration was growing among Britons as Starmer's words seemed increasingly disconnected from their reality. But the real blow came during an interview in which Keir Starmer, eager to reaffirm his commitment to housing promises, was forced to confront the hardest questions. On Andrew Marr's programme, the Labour leader tried to double down on his narrative of progress and prosperity, but the interview quickly turned into a trap for him. "Mr. Starmer, how many homes have actually been built so far as part of your promises?" asked Andrew Marr, his calm demeanour belying the pressure he was applying. "Or are we just talking about a future that never arrives?" Starmer, who had prepared his response in advance, deflected. "What's important is that we're working tirelessly to make the UK a better place to live," he said evasively. "The process takes time, but I can assure you we are committed to the cause." Right, Marr interrupted, his expression skeptical. "But in the meantime, people are still waiting on housing lists. And taxes keep going up. What's the point of promising a better future if the present is getting harder for British families?" Starmer's discomfort was evident. Despite his attempts to defend his position, the reality was starting to catch up with him. The questions didn't stop. Journalists and the public continued to demand clear answers. Media outlets quickly published headlines reflecting the growing dissatisfaction. Keir Starmer, the leader who promises without delivering, was one of the most prominent headlines. Other outlets, such as The Telegraph and The Guardian, also joined the chorus of criticism, arguing that the Labour leader was more interested in selling an image of progress than in delivering real results. The central problem was clear: Starmer was being perceived as someone who said what people wanted to hear but couldn't provide tangible solutions to everyday problems. While the promises kept flowing, the skepticism kept growing. And so, while the Labour Party tried to move forward with its narrative of a better future, the public continued to look on with suspicion, wondering if they would ever see those houses, that extra money in their pockets, or if it would all remain just another empty promise. In 2024, the issue of immigration once again became a hot topic, with over 36,000 migrants crossing the Channel into the UK, a 25% increase compared to 2023. While the figure is still lower than the record-breaking numbers seen in previous years, the questions remain: what's being done about this? Where are the real plans to tackle this problem? The government's promises to get immigration under control seem to have been swallowed up by empty rhetoric. In Parliament, the Interior Secretary stood at the dispatch box, attempting to assure the public that the government was taking robust action to manage the issue. "We are implementing a more stringent approach to tackle illegal immigration," she stated in a press conference, her words crisp, but the air thick with doubt. As always, the opposition was quick to pounce, with the leader of the opposition, a seasoned politician known for his sharp tongue, casting doubt on the government's efforts. "Robust action? More like lip service," he scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Year after year, they've made the same promises, yet nothing ever changes. We need real action, not just a string of empty speeches." His words struck a chord with many in the room. What happened to the firm stance they promised last year? It's the same old story: talk, 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 but no results. The tone in the room was electric, filled with frustration and growing impatience. The press gallery buzzed with murmurs, as the opposition's accusations rang out like a chorus of dissent. "It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion," said one political analyst, shaking his head. "The government keeps changing the narrative, but they never address the real issues. It's as if they're running a marathon without a finish line." Even in the corridors of Westminster, there was a sense of disbelief. A junior minister, who had been tasked with overseeing immigration policy, muttered under his breath, "We're just papering over the cracks. We all know it." His words, though spoken quietly, revealed the underlying frustration felt by many within the ranks of the government. "We've got no real strategy. Just a series of stopgap measures, hoping something will stick." As the debate raged on, the public continued to grow disillusioned. For many, the government's repeated failures to effectively manage immigration felt like a betrayal. "We've had enough of the empty promises," one disgruntled voter commented, shaking his head as he sat in the pub with his mates. "They've been saying the same thing for years, but what's actually changed? Nothing." His words, though blunt, echoed the sentiments of many across the country. And while the political circus in Westminster continued, the public was left to grapple with the growing sense of uncertainty. How long would the government be allowed to get away with doing nothing? With each passing month, the gap between the promises and the reality seemed to widen. Meanwhile, the royal family faced their own set of challenges in 2024. Both the Princess of Wales and King Charles had been battling health issues, with the princess undergoing cancer treatment and the king facing his own medical struggles. Despite their personal battles, they remained ever present in the public eye, trying to convey an image of optimism. In a rare public statement, the king shared a message of hope, saying, "We face difficult times, but we face them together. There is always light at the end of the tunnel." But the message was not without its critics. "It's all well and good to speak of optimism," said a well-known royal commentator, "but the public wants to see action. They've had enough of empty platitudes from both politicians and royalty alike." For many, the royals' personal struggles, though deeply human, seemed to fade into the background as the nation continued to grapple with the very real problems facing the country. Across the country, there was a palpable sense of doubt. As the year came to a close, it seemed that the promises made, whether by politicians or the monarchy, were nothing more than words. "Will 2025 be the year we finally see change?" asked one journalist, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Or will we be here again, talking about the same issues, year after year?" It was clear that many were tired of waiting. Whether it was the immigration crisis or the ongoing struggles of the royal family, there was a collective yearning for something more, something that went beyond the empty promises that had become all too familiar.